You're listening to an Ono Media podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. This is Into the Dark with Payton Moreland, and that's me. I'm so happy you're here. If you're watching on YouTube, please thumbs up, comment, turn on notifications. If you are listening on audio and can leave me a review, I'd love it. But if not, you guys, I am just so happy you're here. Now, before we jump into today's episode, we have to start with my 10 seconds, which is just something to start this episode off on a lighter foot before we get into the darkness. So for my 10 seconds, I wanted to actually teach you a little game that I play as a last resort if I'm struggling with thought spiraling or rumination or just anxiety. Honestly, anything where I can't get in control of my thoughts or I'm just going down and down and down. I've found that this is helpful, and I've actually told a couple people, and then I decided why not just say it on the podcast. So you can actually make it so that your brain can't think of anything else. So what you do is you count down from 7, so 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you're counting, and then you also look around the room. So using your eyes, you look at different objects. So like right now I could look at the camera, then I could look at my viewfinder, then I could look at my light, then I could look at my other light, I could look at my door, all different things. And you also have to keep track. So how it would go is I would say 7 camera, 6 viewfinder, 5 light, 4 light, 3 door, 2 doorstop, 1 outlet. Then I would go back to 6 and start over. So not from 7, but 6. And all different things. 6 basket, 5 book, 4 window, 3 mirror. And then you just obviously go all the way down to 1, and then you can start back over if you need to keep going. But it keeps your mind so busy that it stops whatever train of thought you are going down that you don't want to be going down. Again, I tried different things before this. I tried meditation, but sometimes your brain, it just doesn't speak English. It can't hear you. Actually, oftentimes your brain can't hear you because it's actually your nervous system. And so you have to distract it enough to then calm down your nervous system. So this is just a little thing I do if I am just struggling with unwanted feelings or emotions or thoughts. So try it out if you need to. If not, if you've never had to play the game, then you know what? Good for you, and keep going. But if you ever need the game for whatever reason, you are now free to use it. All right, let's get into the case. Now, trigger warning, this episode does include discussions of murder and pregnancy loss. So please listen with care. Now, just recently, the BBC put out an article titled, "What Does Dying Feel Like?" Supposedly, it tells you everything you need to know about the way your final weeks, days, hours, and minutes will go. Obviously, anyone who's around to research, write, or read the article hasn't actually died. So it's not like there's anybody who can speak up if it gets some of the facts wrong. Either way, the feature lays out all of the steps your body goes through on the way to death, assuming it's not sudden or violent. It says you lose your appetite and then find it harder to stay awake for long periods of times. As your heart gets weaker and your circulation gets worse, you may feel cold. Eventually, you slip into unconsciousness and you don't wake up. It's said that hearing is one of the last senses to go. So even if you can't see or interact with your loved ones, you can still hear whatever they say to you. And then the end comes. Jeez, this was just like not good for my panic at all. Death is a really big trigger for me. And then the end comes, you move on, and nobody who's around now can really say what happens after that point. Well, almost nobody. But history is full of all sorts of stories where people have made contact with the great beyond. Whether it's a deceased loved one appearing in a dream to tell you everything's going to be okay, or a more frightening haunting, there are a ton of accounts that, depending on how skeptical you're feeling, could serve as evidence of an afterlife. In fact, today's story features a murder that was solved thanks to what seemed like testimony from the victim's restless spirit. So this case actually begins all the way back in January of 1897. 1800s, people. We're in West Virginia's Greenbrier County. On the 23rd, a local newlywed named Erasmus Shue headed off to work at the blacksmith shop, just like usual. On his way to the smithy, Erasmus, or Trout, which was what his friends called him, and is honestly easier to say, so it's what I'm going to call him, passed a house where an 11-year-old boy named Andy Jones lived. Now, Trout stopped and asked if Andy could run back to his own home and help his wife with some chores. So Trout's on his way to work, and he passes 11-year-old Andy, and he says, "Hey, Andy, can you head back to my house and help my wife with some chores?" Trout had only been married for a little over 2 months to a woman named Zona Hester Shue. She was 11 years younger than him at 23 years old and still settling into the married life. Now that day, Trout said he figured Zona could use some help gathering eggs and picking things up from the store, especially because she'd been sick recently and she wasn't up to doing any of her usual daily routine. So Trout told 11-year-old Andy he'd appreciate his assistance. Except Andy's mom said he'd already agreed to help some other adults around town that day. He could maybe go check in on Zona, but it would be in an hour. And Trout actually seemed annoyed at that answer, but it's not like he could force Andy to come over any earlier. He didn't try to hide his frustration, but he did head to work. Eventually, once he was free, 11-year-old Andy went to the Shue home to check on Zona. The first thing he did was actually check out the chicken coop for eggs. He didn't find any, but maybe Zona had already gathered them before she knew he was coming over. Except Andy was starting to get a bad feeling, and he didn't really know why. He was noticing little red droplets on the ground. There weren't a lot of them, but it was enough to make him wonder if someone maybe had gotten injured. Filled with dread, he knocked on the front door, but no one answered. It was unlocked though, so he let himself in. And that's when Andy found Zona. She was lying on the floor at the foot of the staircase, flat on her back with her feet together, like she'd just laid down for a nap. One of her arms was at her side and the other one was folded over her torso. Her head was turned and her eyes were wide open. She didn't get up or say anything when Andy opened the door. She was perfectly still and she didn't even seem to be breathing. Now, of course, 11-year-old Andy is terrified, but he worked up his courage and shook Zona's shoulder to see if he could maybe wake her up. She didn't respond and her body was cold when he touched it. He ran all the way back home to get his mother and then sprinted to the blacksmith shop to talk to Trout. Andy gets there and says the same thing. "Hey, I think Zona's dead." Trout and Andy's mother called for a doctor, specifically a man named Dr. George Knapp. Then both headed back to Trout's house to wait for him. By the time Dr. Knapp arrived, Trout had actually moved Zona off the floor and laid her down in their bed. He'd also changed Zona's clothes, which was an odd move on his part, especially if there was any chance that Zona was still alive and needed medical treatment. He said he was helping get Zona's body ready for her funeral. Not that there was any rush at that point, and even in that community, it was traditional for women to prepare a corpse for burial, not the husband. Trout had put her in a dress with a very stiff high collar. And although that was odd, Dr. Knapp examined Zona's body anyway and confirmed that she really was dead. Man, there is just nothing like the 1800s. Now, prior to that point, Zona had been healthy. No one knew of any medical conditions that might kill her so suddenly. Dr. Knapp did notice something that he called a discoloration on her right cheek and the side of her neck. They looked maybe like bruises, but he wasn't sure exactly what they were. After all, the physician didn't get a very good look. He tried to unbutton the top part of Zona's dress to examine the marks on her neck, but then Trout became very distressed, understandably so. It must be a blow to lose your wife of only 3 months. But he was so upset that the doctor immediately stopped what he was doing. It seemed like the only way to get Trout to calm down. Now, Knapp and Andy's mother ended up leaving the house pretty soon afterward, without ever giving Zona a more thorough look over. Her body was then transported to her mother's house afterward. And there, Trout was very involved with the preparation for Zona's funeral. Besides the dress he'd picked out with the very high neck, he also tied a scarf around her neck before her viewing. He said it was Zona's favorite. But even with the scarf and the dress, a lot of mourners at her funeral thought Zona's head looked floppy, like her neck wasn't supporting it properly. At one point, Trout actually folded up a sheet and some of Zona's clothing, and he put them on either side of her head, like he was kind of giving her a pillow. And that's what he said, that he thought these things would help her rest more easily. They also helped prop her head up and keep it from moving around. Afterward, Trout stood by her coffin for the entire service, and he sort of ran off anyone who seemed to look like they were just a little too curious about Zona's body. Before the viewing ended, Zona's mother, Mary, removed the sheet from her coffin, and when she went to wash it later on, it turned the water red. But it wasn't dirty, and Zona wasn't bleeding in the coffin. There was no explanation at the time, and Mary had bigger things on her mind, like getting her daughter ready for her burial. In the meanwhile, Dr. Knapp tried to do a post-mortem exam, but during the procedure, Trout refused to leave her side again. He stood at the top of the table, cradling her head and generally getting into Dr. Knapp's way. It was impossible for him to finish the autopsy, and I'm not sure why the doctor didn't just kick Trout out. Maybe he felt bad for the grieving husband. Maybe this wasn't something they typically did, but instead he decided to give up on finishing the postmortem. Kind of like how he didn't examine Zona that closely in her home right after death. It seemed like any time Knapp tried to check on her, Trout interfered in one way or another. When he filled out Zona's death certificate, the doctor just guessed at what her cause of death might have been. He called it a, quote, everlasting faint, which at the time was a very poetic phrase that basically meant she died of a heart attack. Now later on, in some different paperwork, he also said it was possible that Zona had died of some kind of complication related to pregnancy, even though nobody had heard anything about her being pregnant prior to that point. So the gossip was that maybe she was early enough that she wasn't showing, but then she'd suffered a life-threatening miscarriage and that's what killed her. Now, in fairness, Zona did have one pregnancy out of wedlock before she married Trout. The father was never in the picture and the baby actually didn't survive. But Dr. Knapp might have been making assumptions about a possible pregnancy now based on Zona's history. It's hard to say how likely it was that Zona was pregnant. But I do know that Zona and Trout weren't only newlyweds, they were also basically strangers. They met for the first time in October of 1896, so about 3 months before Zona's death. That day, Zona was in town to buy some supplies for her family's rural farm, and Trout was new to the area. He'd grown up in another county, but he'd come there to work as a laborer. She was 23, again, he was 37, but they still fell for each other right away. Zona was a beautiful young woman with a sweet personality, and Trout was handsome and outgoing. His natural charisma meant people always wanted to be around him, listening to his jokes and stories. Pretty soon, Zona began making lots of excuses to go to town for one errand or another, and during each trip, she found Trout and talked to him. Now, before long, they were head over heels in love. They got married after a couple of weeks. Which I guess would make sense if Zona really was pregnant, but it's also possible that they were just impulsive and in love. Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, wasn't thrilled about Zona's quick rush to the altar. In fact, she actually disapproved of the relationship overall. She didn't like Trout. His outgoing personality, which had been so attractive to Zona, came across as disrespectful and rude to her mother, Mary. She also couldn't help but notice how he flirted with a bunch of different women, even though he was supposed to only be interested in her daughter. Basically, Mary thought Trout was bad news. And after the wedding, Mary and Zona stopped talking to one another because they disagreed so fundamentally about her husband and her marriage. So for 3 months, Zona was totally isolated from her family, spending all of her time with her new husband. They never reconciled before her death. Zona's sudden death meant they never would get to make up either. Now, Mary was completely stunned and unsettled. She'd been very close to her daughter until the wedding, and it just felt wrong that their relationship would end on such a sour, tragic note. She couldn't let go of her grief. For weeks after Zona's funeral, Mary had terrible insomnia. Every night she'd lie awake staring at the bedroom ceiling. And then once her husband was asleep, she'd sneak into Zona's old room. Then she'd lie in her departed daughter's bed and keep lying awake. She thought about Zona and how little her death made sense. It almost kind of became an obsession for her. Then one night, a few weeks after Zona's death, everything came to a head. Mary was awake in bed, just like normal, when she saw a brilliant light shining on the other side of the room. Someone stepped out of it, and according to her, it was Zona, or I guess more accurately, Zona's ghost. She was still wearing her dress from her funeral with the same hairstyle, like death hadn't changed her appearance at all. And as soon as Mary saw her dead daughter's spirit, Zona asked if she could get into bed with her, like a little girl who wanted to cuddle with her mother. Mary said it was okay, but when Zona climbed under the blankets, she was ice cold. Mary also couldn't help but notice that her body seemed solid. It was like she'd climbed out of her grave. Zona explained that she'd come back because she had something important to tell Mary, specifically that she was murdered. Then she told her mother the story of how she lost her life. The night before her body was found, so that would be January 22nd, 1897, Zona made dinner for her husband. It was all ready by the time he got home from work. This was just like usual. But the meal she'd made that night was very light and vegetarian. It included bread, apples, jellies, and 2 different kinds of butter. Apparently, Zona felt sick that night and wasn't up to cooking anything more elaborate than that. Except Trout didn't want to eat bread and butter with apples. He wanted meat. A fight broke out, and Trout said he was going to throw Zona out of the house. He packed up all of her things, and he was so rough with them that he actually damaged some of her property. Then Zona got quiet. Again, this is all according to her mother. She couldn't tell her mother what happened after that. Mary wanted to hear the rest of the story. I'm not sure on the exact details, but it sounds like Zona's ghost then left or faded away before she could finish. But the next night, she came back again. She reminded Mary that Trout had been furious that there was no meat for dinner. Then she picked up where she'd left off. She said her fight with Trout just escalated and escalated until finally he grabbed her by the neck and squeezed so hard that he broke it right by her top neck bone. Then she coughed up some blood as she died. Zona laid there until the next day when her husband set it up so the neighbor boy, the 11-year-old, could come find her body. This was all very disturbing, but Zona wasn't finished telling her mother about her murder. A 3rd night in a row, she appeared again and talked about how her husband had killed her. And she did the same thing on the 4th. That time, she showed off her broken neck by turning her head around 360 degrees, just like the girl from The Exorcist. Each time she visited her mother, Mary, she complained that Trout had been abusive. The murder was just the latest in a string of violent attacks. During one of those ghost visits, Zona also described a certain rocky patch in a nearby meadow. She said that Mary could find a cellar door there, and if she went into the cellar, she'd find something. Zona didn't specify what Mary would discover there, but just mentioned it. So either way, after 4 nights, Mary decides that Zona was telling her all of this, visiting her at night because she wanted people to know. She needed for her murderous husband to be exposed. So Mary decided to follow Zona's instructions, or ghost of Zona's instructions, and see what was in that cellar. She went to the meadow she described, found the rocky area, and then actually located a door in the ground. When Mary went inside, she glanced at the door frame, and she saw blood smeared across the right side. It wasn't super clear what this had to do with Zona's murder necessarily. If she was choked to death at home, that wouldn't leave blood on a cellar door in another part of town. Maybe it was unrelated, and Zona just told Mary about the bloody door to prove she was telling the truth. Either way, Mary began talking about the ghostly visitations all around town. Now, naturally, some people were skeptical when they heard the story. It was no secret that Mary hadn't approved of Trout when he married Zona, so maybe she was just making up these ghost encounters to ruin the widower's reputation. Or she might have imagined the entire thing, especially because Zona apparently only visited Mary at night when she was alone in bed. Lots of people figured that Mary had just drifted off to sleep. She was having a vivid dream about her daughter, but Mary insisted. She didn't remember falling asleep or waking up. She was positive that she was fully alert the entire time her daughter would come visit her. So Mary eventually reached out to a local law enforcement official. She told him the same thing she told everyone else about Zona's ghost visiting her and accusing Trout of murder. Now, of course, he didn't take Mary too seriously at first, but he did promise her that he'd look into it, just in case there was some evidence to be uncovered. Then he chatted with Dr. Knapp about Zona's death, and that's when the investigators' spidey senses really started tingling. Dr. Knapp obviously explained about the possible bruising on Zona's neck and how her head wouldn't stay upright, and he did admit that Trout had acted pretty strange after Zona died. He described the ways Trout kept stopping him from examining Zona's body, especially her neck, and how he'd stood by her coffin at the funeral and prevented everyone else from getting a good look. As it turned out, Trout had also been behaving oddly since Zona's burial. He came across as very happy. He wasn't mourning at all. The details were all just suspicious enough for the authorities to disinter Zona's body. They wanted to conduct a real post-mortem exam and see if there was any evidence of a murder. So now they're finally going to take a look at the body. Now, before the autopsy, the police sent some officers to Trout's home. They wanted him to be present for the procedure, but he tried to refuse to go with them. He also made a very weird comment when he tried to explain why he didn't want to come. He said, "They will not be able to prove I did it." Keep in mind, by this point, the officials still weren't even sure if they wanted to treat Zona's death as a murder. So the fact that her husband was even thinking in terms of whether anyone could prove that he had murdered her, it suggested he already knew what those autopsy results were going to say, which was one more point in the Trout looks guilty column. Now, during the procedure, there were 3 doctors and 5 law enforcement officers present, plus Trout. With so many witnesses, he couldn't interfere or grab Zona's head like he had the last time. When the doctors checked Zona's stomach, they saw that her last meal was bread, butter, jam, and apples. Exactly what the ghost had told Mary, which was interesting because nobody had asked Trout what they'd had for dinner that night. Then, one of the morticians unbuttoned the top of Zona's dress. Her head flopped off to the side. Like, without the collar to support her neck, it just couldn't stay in place. So then, the coroner identified a break in Zona's spinal column, right between the first and second vertebrae. It was the exact same spot that Zona had described when she told Mary that her husband had broken her neck under the first joint. And the autopsy also showed that her windpipe had been crushed. The damage was consistent with strangulation. They even confirmed that those discolorations Dr. Knapp had seen earlier were fingerprint-shaped bruises, which really seemed to confirm for a lot of people that there was something to Mary's dream. Up until that point, she could have been making lucky guesses, but there was just no way she could have known that kind of detailed medical information. Still, I can't blame the local authorities for being hesitant about basing an investigation on testimony from a ghost. After all, by this point, they knew Zona had been choked to death, but they couldn't prove Trout had done it. However, once they took a closer look at Trout's background, they realized they didn't really need to rely on what Zona was supposedly telling Mary. There was plenty of incriminating evidence against him already. As it turned out, Zona wasn't Trout's first wife. She was his 4th, and 2 of his previous 2 brides had died under highly suspicious circumstances. One wife fell off a haystack and fatally broke her neck. There are different contradictory accounts of what happened to the other one. In one version of the story, Trout and his wife had been married for less than a year. One day he was fixing a chimney and she filled a basket with heavy rocks or bricks for him to use in the repair. Then when she handed the basket up to Trout, one of the bricks fell out and hit her on the head, and it killed her instantly. There were no witnesses around, and a lot of people thought it was odd that the brick just happened to fall directly on her and kill her. But there was also no evidence that Trout had killed her on purpose, so nobody pressed any charges. Another account was that she fell through thin ice and either froze to death or drowned. Some people even said someone had poisoned the second wife, but the killer was never caught. And as for his other spouse, not counting Zona and the other 2 who were dead, she divorced Trout on the grounds that he was very physically abusive. After one fight, he'd gathered all of her things and tossed them outside. This is just like what Zona's ghost had told Mary he'd done to her. Trout also had a criminal history. He'd been convicted of stealing a horse, and he'd spent 2 years in prison for the crime. Now, this was all enough to charge Trout with first-degree murder, and his trial began the following summer. And the jurors went on to find Trout guilty of Zona's murder, and they sentenced him to life in prison. Now, apparently, some of the locals thought that punishment wasn't severe enough. After the trial wrapped up, a mob tried to drag him out of the jailhouse and hang him for the crime, but some officials talked the crowd down and got them to disperse without any violence. The incident still left Trout shaken. His hands were trembling so badly afterward he couldn't even tie his own shoes. After this, he was transferred to a prison facility where he'd be safer. There, Trout only ended up serving 2.5 years of that sentence because on March 1st, 1900, he died of an illness at 39 years old. And in the meantime, this county had become famous for its historic ghost. Even though the judge told the jury to ignore Mary's story about Zona's spirit, the general consensus was that Trout had been convicted on the strength of Mary's testimony. So Zona became known as their local ghost. And today, the region is considered one of the most haunted parts of West Virginia. And not only because of the story of Zona. See, a decade before her murder, a local church had been converted into a field hospital during the Civil War. It's said the spirits of the soldiers who lost their lives in battle also linger in the county. And supernatural enthusiasts flock to the area for all kinds of spectral encounters. So none of us actually understands what happens after death. And even with ghost stories like these, we only get the teeniest sliver of a possible explanation. Just enough to whet our appetite and to leave us wondering how much more there is to discover about our mysterious world and whatever lies beyond. I hope you guys enjoyed this ghost story that still had a bit of murder in it. Again, I'm trying to broaden our scopes as we go into the darkness together, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.